Good Shabbos. This past week we celebrated Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day. And this week we're going to read from the portion of Emor. Last week we read from the portion of Kedoshim. What is the connection? Emor tells us how a Kohen is supposed to be holy, more holy than the rest of the Jewish people. The portion of Kedoshim talked about even the rest of the Jewish people are supposed to be holy. Kedoshim Tiyu, you shall be holy. So it seems to be saying that, yes, all the Jewish people have to be holy, the Kohanim have to be on a higher level. But even about the rest of the Jews, another part of the Torah tells us that the Jews are Mamleches Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. They're a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So the expectation that the Torah has for the Jewish people is not just to be average. It's not just to be following the din, the law. But rather, as Nachmanides says, the portion of Kedoshim is telling us that we all have to aspire to go lifnim mishras din, beyond the letter of law. And not only to aspire, but sometimes it's a requirement. There are certain laws which the Torah is inputting into the law book that you can't just follow what's right, you have to follow what's the aspiration of being greater than what's just correct, but rather to be more holy or to be special, to devote ourselves more to God, but maybe more importantly, to devote ourselves more on the level of bein adam lachaver, between man and his fellow man. Because if you look at the commandments in the beginning of Kedoshim, there are a few laws which seem to be more of a spiritual or ritual basis, but many of the laws are how you should treat your fellow man, how you should honor your father and mother, how you shouldn't hold back the pay of a worker, how you should not put a stumbling block before a blind person. It's saying that we have to be extra special careful. And we talk about Yom Ha'atzmaut and Independence Day. I think we all have to agree that the Jewish people have their foundation in the Torah. Whether you're religious or secular, no one can deny that the springboard for Judaism and for the Jewish nation is the Torah. And therefore, I think it's fitting to say that in general, the Torah should be our guidebook for how we should act as a Jewish people and how the nation of Israel should act. And there are many people who would maybe say that Israel isn't necessarily following the most spiritual approach to life. They might not be the most religiously observant, but I would argue that in the area of bein adam lachaver, between man and his fellow man, actually there's Israeli exceptionalism. Now you can go to the Knesset and see people screaming at each other. You can see people arguing passionately over parking spaces. Of course, Israel is not perfect, but we could look at what's happening today in Gaza. Whereas the rest of the world, or many people in the world, are saying, no, the Jews are performing atrocities and they're genocidal, we know that's not to be the case. The UN and all the media have said that more civilians were killed than we could possibly imagine. They said up to 40. They keep quoting up to 40,000, but actually the Hamas Ministry of Health only put it at 35,000. The UN just downgraded it to 25,000, and then they said, well, the 10,000 they're just missing. Don't say the 10,000 are people who are unidentified. They're saying they're just missing. Maybe they're buried under the rubble. We don't know. In other words, there's absolutely no account for that 10,000. Now, why is this important? There's still so many people have been killed. When you look at what urban warfare is like and what other countries have, how other countries have performed in urban warfare, there's usually, I think, at least a 3-to-1 ratio civilians to militants in urban warfare. Israel claims that they killed about 14,000 or so Hamas militants. Calling them militants, it's Hamas terrorists. So if that's true, and there's only 25,000 that we know for sure are dead, it's less than 1-to-1. And even if the Israeli numbers are mistaken, and maybe there's some of those people are really missing, it sounds like it's about 1-to-1, maybe a little bit over 1-to-1. So what is Israel doing? Israel is risking the lives of Israeli citizens and, more importantly, Israeli soldiers who are going into Gaza. And they're not just carpet bombing like the United States did in Dresden, or dropping bombs like they did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the London bombing by the Germans. Israel is trying as best as it could to target people who are our enemies, who are terrorists. And of course, in war, there are going to be innocent people who die. And more importantly, here, Hamas wants them to die. This is no question about it. There's no dispute that Hamas is hiding behind citizens and wants them to die. So Israel, even under the harshest circumstances, and especially here where they're in tunnels, and they tunnel under public buildings, under UNRWA headquarters, under schools, hide munitions and missiles in mosques and schools and in civilian neighborhoods. Israel is doing an unbelievable job of trying to maintain as low a ratio of civilians to militants as possible. And it's not just in that. There was a recent study of the happiest countries in the world, and the question, of course, is how do you determine that? Bottom line, Israel dropped. It used to be number 4, and now it's number 5. And as was pointed out, this was after a year of terrible debates in Israel about judicial reform, and it was after the war started. I believe it happened in January of this year, so it was after a few months of the war in Gaza, and Israelis are still happy. And I was listening to a podcast of Times of Israel Daily Briefing today on Friday, and listening to someone, Chaviv Retik Gor, and he talks about how we should be so optimistic about the future of Israel. It's worth listening to that podcast if you could. But basically, the arguments were that the reason Israelis are happy is because they live for a purpose. The youth in Israel have risen to the occasion, and they're getting up to fight. They're not like the youth who are just down the street standing in protest about the genocide in Israel. And by the way, I asked them which genocide, the genocide of Hamas, genocide of Israel. They didn't want to engage in discussion, and when I asked more than once, they said I was being aggressive. It's just, the ultimate irony that I was considered aggressive, and they're implicitly supporting, not explicitly supporting Hamas, and signs there from the river to the sea, which is to eradicate the Jewish people. Be that as it may, Israel is really trying and is successful in acting as a humane military, and the people are happy because they're united. And when I say united, it's not just that united because we're fighting our enemies, which is true, but it's because Israelis are happy because they have a goal and a purpose. There's a national health care. People are taken care of. That's lifnim mishur sadin. That's beyond the letter of the law. That's the Israeli government saying we are not going to let anybody slide into poverty where they can't take care of themselves. Israel is a place where when you're in a community, someone has your back. Someone's willing to, as he said, run into a fire to save you, or go into Gaza and put their lives in danger, put themselves at risk, and their families are proud of their children who are going to put their lives at risk to save other Jews, and at the same time trying to the best of their ability not to harm innocent civilians. This is just one area, and you could debate whether Israel is really living up to this Kedoshim Tiyu, whether we're being completely holy, but I think that Israel, and I think it's because we try as much as possible to live up to the morals that the Torah gave us, trying to live as much a life of Kedusha, of holiness, of being beyond the letter of the law. In all realms, maybe not. Could Israel be better? No one would argue that it's perfect. And especially if you want to look at it specifically from a religious point of view, from being observant, yes. But we still have a lot to be proud of. We have a lot to be optimistic about. And we could say that this idea of being kadosh, of being a mamleches kohanim, v'gai kadosh, being a nation of priests and a holy nation is something that we aspire to. We should continue to aspire to. And it gives us reason to be optimistic about the future. And there's the sense that if we're doing the right thing, God will be on our side. Ultimately, we will be successful. Ultimately, we'll be victorious. Ultimately, we'll survive, and we will thrive. And if we follow this approach and we go into the future that way, and it's both, of course, in Israel and in Chutz La'aretz, outside of Israel, we all have to act in that way. And And that's when we could really look forward to the coming eventually of Mashiach, of the ultimate redemption. Good Shabbos.